The snow wasn't hiding the tracks, it was revealing them. Every scuff, every deep print from a heavy boot was a story written in white. And Jedediah Boone, a man who'd learned to read the wilderness like a book, knew this story wasn't about a deer. This was a man's trail. A man in a hurry, pushing hard through the deep powder, not caring about the noise he made. That was the first thing that was wrong. In these mountains, you didn't make noise unless you were the biggest thing on the food chain, or you were chasing something you wanted more than your own life. Jedediah pulled his horse to a stop, the beast's breath pluming in the biting air. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. The woods had gone quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but a held breath kind of quiet. The kind that comes when a predator is near. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking with a soft crunch, his hand already resting on the worn grip of the rifle slung over his back. He'd been tracking this man for 2 days, a ghost leaving sloppy tracks, heading deeper into the unforgiving heart of the Gray Peaks. Jedediah hadn't come out here for sport. He'd come because he felt a splinter in the world, a wrongness that had drifted up to his remote cabin on the wind. He moved forward, slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the dense line of pines ahead. He passed the husk of a burned-out cabin, its stone chimney leaning like a tired old man. He'd passed that ruin 1,000 times, a landmark in his solitary life, a reminder that nothing lasts out here. Not wood, not bone, not hope. He moved past a creek, its surface frozen into a sheet of milky glass. The world was stripped of color, just endless shades of white and gray. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, a blade of ice with every breath. He was a man who preferred the company of silence, but this was different. This was the quiet of something waiting, and that's when he saw it. Through a break in the trees, a shape. It was dark against the snow, slumped at the base of a massive pine. At first, he thought it was a bear, sleeping off a winter meal, but the shape was too small, too still, a wrong kind of still. He raised his rifle, the cold metal of familiar weight against his shoulder, and peered through the sight. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't a shadow, it was a person, and they were chained to the tree. His heart, a slow and steady drum that had beat in time with the seasons for 20 years, kicked into a frantic rhythm. He lowered the rifle and moved into the clearing, each step a conscious effort to remain silent. The snow muffled his approach. The figure didn't move. As he got closer, the horror sharpened into focus. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her clothes were torn to ribbons, offering no protection from the relentless cold. Her skin was the color of bleached bone, her hair a tangled mat of frost and dirt. But it was the chains that made his stomach turn. Thick, rusted iron cuffs were locked around her wrists. A heavy length of chain was wrapped around the trunk of the ancient pine, looped through a ring that had been brutally hammered deep into the bark. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a hunter caught in their own trap. This was an execution, a slow, cruel one, designed to let the wilderness do the dirty work. Someone had meant for her to be forgotten here, to be erased by the snow and the cold, as if she had never existed at all. Jedediah felt a cold fury rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He knelt beside her, his knees protesting in the deep snow. He expected to find her gone, her spirit already fled from this frozen prison. But as he leaned in, a flicker of movement. Her eyelids, crusted with ice, fluttered. They opened, just a crack, and her eyes found his. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but in their depths, a fire still burned. A stubborn, defiant ember refusing to be extinguished. She wasn't begging. She wasn't pleading. She just looked at him, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, brutal world. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice a low growl, rough from disuse. Her lips, cracked and blue, parted. A wisp of vapor, barely visible, escaped. She spoke a single word, a whisper that the wind almost stole before it reached him. "Eloise!" He nodded, already shrugging off his heavy bearskin coat. He wrapped it around her, and she flinched at the sudden contact, then went limp, a shiver racking her thin frame. "Don't move," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt, the blade gleaming dully in the gray light. He wedged the tip between the rusted chain link and the tree and began to saw, the screech of metal on metal, a jarring violation of the forest's silence. He put his shoulder into it, gritting his teeth, until with a final, groaning snap, the link gave way. The chain fell into the snow with a muffled clink. The woman, Eloise, slumped forward, unconscious. He caught her easily. She weighed next to nothing, as light as a bundle of dried sticks. He lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest, and turned back the way he came. His horse snorted, its eyes wide, sensing the change. Jedediah mounted, settling her in front of him, one arm holding her secure. Her head lolled against his chest. As he nudged the horse into a slow walk, he glanced back at the clearing, at the empty chain, the disturbed snow. And then she stirred, her voice a dry rattle. "He's coming back," she breathed against his coat. Jedediah went still. His blood ran cold. He looked down at her, but her eyes were closed again. Not they. He. Who was he? The man he'd been tracking? Or someone else entirely? The mystery of the woman in his arms suddenly grew darker, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. The ride back to his cabin was a grim, silent journey against a wind that seemed determined to peel the flesh from his bones. The woman, Eloise, was a feather-light weight in his arms, her breathing shallow and ragged. With every step the horse took, Jedediah felt the weight of her story, a story he didn't know but could feel pressing in on him. This wasn't the work of bandits. They would have been quicker, messier. This was personal. This was hatred, cold and patient. The kind of hatred that festers in small towns where fear wears the mask of righteousness. He'd seen it before, a lifetime ago. By the time the squat, dark shape of his cabin appeared through the swirling snow, dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. He pushed the door open with his boot and carried her inside, the warmth from the hearth washing over them. He laid her gently on the cot he'd built with his own hands, the one his wife used to sleep on. The thought came unbidden and he shoved it away, stoking the fire until flames licked greedily at the fresh logs. He worked methodically, pulling off her frozen boots, his gut clenching when he saw her toes, blue and lifeless. He began rubbing them, trying to force life back into them, his touch gentle but firm. He wiped her face clean with a damp cloth, washing away the grime and the frost. Her eyes fluttered open again, slow and uncertain. They darted around the small one-room cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the rifle leaning by the door. Her gaze was not one of relief. It was the look of a cornered animal, unsure if it had been rescued or simply moved to a new cage. "I ain't going to hurt you," Jedediah said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. He ladled some warm broth into a cup and held it to her lips. She drank in small, hesitant sips. "I'm Jedediah," he offered. Her eyes drifted from the fire to his face. "Why?" she whispered, the single word hanging in the air between them. He didn't have an answer for that, not a simple one anyway. He sat on the stool beside the cot, the silence stretching, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "Because it ain't right what they did." He draped a thick wool blanket over her, tucking it in around her shoulders. As he did, the collar of her ragged dress fell open, and there on the pale skin of her shoulder was a mark. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand, deliberately and cruelly burned into her flesh. A perfect circle, a serpent, coiled and eating its own tail. Jedediah froze, his hand hovering in midair. The broth cup slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. He felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been punched. He knew that symbol. He had spent years of his life hunting the men who wore it, a lifetime ago. He had prayed to God he would never see it again. This wasn't the work of fearful villagers. This was the work of the Ashwood Brethren, and they were supposed to be long dead and buried. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over Jedediah. The Ashwood Brethren, a name whispered in fearful tones by lawmen and outlaws alike. They weren't just a gang. They were a plague, a shadow that had once stretched across the territories, built on fear and blood. He had thought the shadow was gone, burned away in a fiery raid that had cost him everything. But this brand, stark and ugly on this woman's skin, was proof that some evils don't die. They just go to ground. They wait. He looked from the brand to her face. Her eyes were open, watching him. She had seen his reaction, the blood drain from his face, the sudden stillness in his body. There was no more suspicion in her gaze, only a weary, terrible understanding. "You know what it is," she whispered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You know who they are." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The fragile piece of his cabin was shattered, replaced by the ghost of a war he thought he had escaped. He was no longer just a man who had found a victim in the snow. He was a man who had just stumbled back into his own grave. Before he could form a reply, before he could ask the thousand questions screaming in his mind, another sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, a single horse moving with a steady, confident gait. Not the sound of a lost traveler. This was the sound of a hunter. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from beside the door. He moved to the single small window, peering out through a crack in the wooden shutter. A lone rider was approaching, a dark silhouette against the swirling white. The rider stopped just at the edge of the clearing, sitting tall in the saddle, making no move to dismount. He seemed to be staring directly at the cabin, as if he knew exactly who and what was inside. "Jedediah," a voice called out, carrying clearly on the wind. It was a calm voice, almost conversational, yet it dripped with a chilling confidence. "The ghost of the gray peaks. I'll be damned." The stories were true. Jedediah's knuckles went white around the stock of his rifle. Ghost of the Gray Peaks, a name he hadn't heard in a decade, a name he had earned and then tried to bury. Only a handful of men alive knew that name, and all of them were either lawmen or they were brethren. He didn't need to see the man's face. He already knew. The sloppy tracks in the snow suddenly made sense. They weren't sloppy. They were a message, a lure. The man he'd been tracking hadn't been running from something. He had been leading him straight to her. It had all been a trap, and he had walked right into it. The man in the clearing sat on his horse, patient as a vulture. He was a specter from a past Jedediah had bled to forget. "I know she's in there, Jedediah," the voice called again, smooth as poison honey. "Her name is Eloise. She has something that belongs to my employers, something very important. Just send her out, and you can go back to your miserable haunt. No one else has to know you're still breathing." Jedediah's mind raced. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a hostage negotiation, and he was on the wrong side of the door. He glanced back at Eloise. She was pushing herself up on one elbow, her eyes wide with a terror that was sharp and immediate. This was the he she had warned him about. "His name is Silas," she breathed, her voice trembling. "He's the one who left me there." Silas. The name hit Jedediah like a physical blow. Silas Kane, Malachi's right-hand man, a cold-blooded killer with a reputation for enjoying his work. Jedediah had put a bullet in Silas's shoulder during that final, bloody raid 10 years ago. He'd seen the man go down. He thought he was dead. "Silas is supposed to be rotting in the ground," Jedediah muttered. "Looks like he ain't," he growled back through the heavy oak door. "And the woman stays with me." A soft, cruel chuckle drifted back from the clearing. "I was afraid you'd say that, Ghost. I truly was." The world exploded in a spray of splintered wood and glass. A gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet punched through the shutter, missing Jedediah's head by inches and burying itself in the log wall behind him. He dropped to the floor, pulling Eloise down with him. The siege had begun. This wasn't his quiet, solitary cabin anymore. It was a tomb, and Silas was standing outside with a shovel. Jedediah crawled to the hearth, his movements practiced and sure. He wasn't just a hermit. His cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a fortress, built by a man who had spent years waiting for his past to come knocking. And the knocking had just started. He grabbed a second rifle from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. He checked the load and tossed it to Eloise. "Can you use this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She looked at the heavy weapon, then at him, her fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of something harder. She nodded, her jaw tight. "My husband taught me. Another shot rang out, this one taking out the other window. Snow and frigid air blasted into the room. "You're outnumbered, Jedediah," Silas shouted. "My friends are on their way. This can be easy, or it can be the last thing you ever do." Jedediah ignored him. He crawled to the side of the blown-out window, keeping low. He could see Silas now, a dark shape reloading his pistol. Jedediah lifted his own rifle, settled the sight on the man's chest, and took a steadying breath. This was it. The ghost was about to come out and play. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, its roar shaking the small cabin. Outside, Silas cried out, a sharp curse swallowed by the wind. The dark shape stumbled back, clutching his arm, and melted into the trees. For a moment, there was silence. The immediate threat was gone. But Jedediah knew this was just the beginning. Silas would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. He turned to Eloise, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. The look on her face was grim. "Time to talk," Jedediah said, his voice flat and hard as iron. "Everything. Now. What did you take from them?" Eloise's story tumbled out, a torrent of secrets and lies held back by a dam of fear. The tale she told wasn't of pious townsfolk and false accusations. That was a lie, a test to see what kind of man Jedediah was. The truth was far uglier. Her husband, Liam, hadn't been a simple man broken by war. He was one of them, a member of the Ashwood Brethren. He wasn't a soldier in their ranks, just an associate, a bookkeeper who thought he was smarter than the monsters he served. "He wasn't a bad man," she started, her voice cracking. "Not at first, but he got in deep. He saw how they operated, the money they were making, the people they hurt. He got scared. He wanted out. Liam's plan had been desperate and foolish. He didn't just run. He stole their lifeline. He took their ledger, not a simple book of accounts, but their Bible of sin. It held everything, every name, every bribe paid to a lawman, every shipment route for stolen goods, every dark deal made in smoke-filled rooms from here to the coast. It was the book that could burn their entire empire to the ground. They found out, of course, men like that always do. They came for him one night. Eloise had hidden while Liam faced them. They hadn't been loud. It was quick, brutal, and quiet. Before they killed him, they tortured him, trying to find out where he had hidden the ledger. But Liam had held his tongue. He died protecting his secret, protecting her. After they were gone, they left a message for her. Silas and his men came back, dragged her from her home, branded her like cattle, and chained her to that tree. It wasn't just a death sentence. It was a warning to anyone who crossed the Brethren, and it was a slow, agonizing method to try and break her, hoping she'd scream the ledger's location to the uncaring trees. "They think I know where it is," she finished, her voice a raw whisper. "But I don't. Liam never told me. I swear it." Jedediah listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture he knew all too well, a picture painted in blood and betrayal. He finally understood why Silas had left her alive, why he'd set this elaborate trap. They didn't want her dead. They wanted the key to their destruction. He looked at her, at the brand on her shoulder, the raw fear in her eyes, and he felt that old familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The weight of duty, the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. "Why me?" she asked, her voice small. "Why this cabin?" Jedediah ran a hand over his tired face. "Because they weren't the only ones with a ghost story," he said, his voice low. He told her everything, about his life before the mountains, about the badge he used to wear. U.S. Marshal Jedediah Boone. He told her about the raid, the one that was supposed to wipe the Brethren off the map for good. It had been an ambush. They'd been sold out by a mole in the marshal's office. He described the chaos, the gunfire, watching his partner, his best friend, die in his arms. After the smoke cleared, the Brethren who escaped, led by their shadowy leader Malachi, had sent him a message. A small wooden box left on his doorstep. Inside was a single lock of his wife's golden hair, and a note. "We know where you live." So he ran. He took his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter, and they vanished. They became ghosts, drifting from one dusty town to the next, always looking over their shoulder. But you can't outrun fate. A fever took them both one bitter winter. 3 years later, he buried them on a lonely hill and kept going, eventually finding his way to these mountains, the one place on earth he felt he could truly disappear. He hadn't been hiding. He'd been serving a life sentence in a prison of his own making. And now the jailers had found the key. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with the ghosts of their shared enemy. They were two strangers, bound together by a legacy of violence they had both tried to escape. Outside, the wind howled a mournful song. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time, Eloise looked at Jedediah not as a savior or a captor, but as a fellow survivor, a man as broken and haunted as she was. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady now, the fear replaced by a grim resolve. Jedediah paced the small cabin, his mind working, falling back into old, forgotten patterns. The mind of a lawman, a strategist. Silas was wounded, he began, thinking aloud. He'll go back to their camp, but he won't wait. He'll bring them all. We have maybe a few hours. We can't stay here. This cabin is a coffin now. He stopped, turning to face her. We have to find that ledger. It's the only thing that can end this. It's the only thing they want. But I told you I don't know where it is, Eloise insisted, her voice rising with desperation. Liam never said a word. Think, Eloise, Jedediah pressed, his tone urgent but not unkind. He must have given you a clue. A story he told, a favorite place, a riddle, anything. Eloise squeezed her eyes shut, her hands twisting in the rough fabric of the blanket. She thought back to those last few frantic days with Liam, his eyes always wide, always looking at the door. He was paranoid, jumpy. He talked in circles, muttering about safe places, about ghosts. Her eyes snapped open. Ghosts, she whispered. He kept talking about the ghost of the Gray Peaks. He said it was the only place the brethren were afraid to go. He said he found a place where the ghost keeps his memories. Jedediah froze mid-pace. He looked around the cabin, then his eyes went distant. Where the ghost keeps his memories, he repeated slowly. His gaze drifted towards the window, towards the dark line of trees. Liam hadn't just been running to any random patch of wilderness. He had run here, to Jedediah's territory, on purpose. He had used Jedediah's legend as a shield, and the hiding place. It couldn't be. It was too simple, too brazen. A clearing, Jedediah said, his voice barely a whisper, with a creek frozen mid-whisper, and a single stone chimney standing against the sky. Eloise stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. How did you know that? Because I passed it on my way to you, he said, his voice grim. The old burned-out cabin, it's been a ruin for 50 years. Liam, the clever, damned fool, he had hidden the most dangerous object in the territory right under the ghost's nose, in the one landmark everyone knew, the one place no one would ever think to look twice. The key to their salvation or their damnation was sitting in a pile of ash and forgotten memories, less than a mile away. They had to get there, before the entire Ashwood brethren descended upon them. There was no more time for talk. Action was the only language the wilderness understood. Jedediah moved with a frantic, purposeful energy. He grabbed a leather satchel and began stuffing it with anything they could carry. Dried meat, a handful of hardtack biscuits, a pouch of ammunition, a flint and steel. Every second was precious. The head start Silas's injury had given them was a gift they couldn't afford to waste. Get your coat, he ordered Eloise, who was already on her feet, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a newfound fire. She was no longer just a victim. She was a soldier in a war she hadn't chosen. They burst out of the cabin door into the frigid, pre-dawn gloom. The wind had died down, and the world was eerily silent. The snow seemed to glow with a faint, ethereal light. Jedediah led his horse from the lean-to, its breath misting in the air. He helped Eloise mount, then swung himself up behind her, taking the reins. Hold on tight, he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He nudged the horse forward, not back the way he had come, but on a different path, a treacherous shortcut through the thickest part of the woods. Every snapped twig, every crunch of snow under the horse's hooves sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. The journey was a nightmare of weaving through dense trees and navigating steep, snow-covered ravines. Jedediah pushed the horse hard, his senses on high alert, constantly scanning the woods around them. He could feel them. He couldn't see them or hear them yet, but he could feel the pressure of the hunt, a tangible force pressing in on them from all sides. They were the prey, and the wolves were closing in. Eloise was rigid in front of him, her body tense, but she didn't make a sound. She was a part of him now, her survival tied to his. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin. Ahead, through the dense foliage, he could see it, the clearing, and rising from the center like a skeletal finger pointing at the gray sky was the stone chimney, the burned-out cabin. They had made it. He slid from the saddle, pulling Eloise down with him. "Stay with the horse," he commanded, his rifle already in his hands. "If you hear anything, you ride. You ride west and you don't look back. You understand?" She nodded, her eyes huge in the dim light. He moved into the clearing, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The ruin was even more desolate up close. The foundation stones were just visible, outlining a home that had been consumed by fire long ago. All that remained was the hearth and chimney, a tombstone for a forgotten family. He ran his hands over the cold stones, searching, feeling for anything loose. "A loose stone," Eloise called softly from the edge of the clearing. "Liam said something about a loose stone, third from the top, on the side that faces the rising sun." Jedediah moved to the eastern side of the chimney. He counted the stones. 1, 2, 3. He pushed. The stone didn't budge. He pushed harder, gritting his teeth, his muscles straining. Nothing. Cursing under his breath, he pulled out his hunting knife, trying to wedge it into the cracks. It was then that a shadow fell over him. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. They weren't alone. Figures were emerging from the trees on all sides of the clearing, dark shapes moving with a silent, predatory grace. They were surrounded. A man stepped forward, separating himself from the others. He was older than Silas, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the cold, placid eyes of a fanatic. He was dressed not like an outlaw, but like a traveling preacher. He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "Jedediah Boone," the man said, his voice calm and resonant. "The ghost who walks. I am Malachi, and I believe you have something of mine." At his side stood Silas, his arm in a crude sling, a hateful sneer on his face. The trap hadn't been at the cabin. The cabin had been the bait. This was the trap, and it had just sprung. Jedediah's blood ran cold. Malachi, the leader. The man who had built the brethren from a band of thugs into a criminal empire. The man who had ordered the death of his partner. The man who had threatened his family. He was supposed to be a ghost himself, a name in a dusty file. But here he was, flesh and blood, standing 10 feet away. Jedediah slowly stood up, his hand never leaving the hilt of his knife. He was a wolf cornered by a pack of hyenas. "You're a long way from home, Malachi," Jedediah said, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. Malachi's smile didn't waver. "Home is where the work is, and my work is here. Now be a reasonable man. The ledger, give it to me, and I will let the woman live. A fair trade, I think." His eyes flickered to Eloise, who stood frozen by the horse, her face a mask of terror. "As for you, Jedediah, your time ran out 10 years ago. You're living on borrowed time." "The ledger isn't here," Jedediah bluffed, his mind racing, looking for an angle, an escape route that wasn't there. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't lie to us, ghost. We know Liam was a sentimental fool. He hid it here. We've been watching this ruin for a week." So that was it. They hadn't been hunting him. They had been waiting for Eloise to lead them to the prize. Jedediah's mind snagged on something Malachi said. "I will let the woman live." He made no such promise for Jedediah. This was never going to end with him walking away. He knew that now. It was going to end here, in the snow, beside this forgotten hearth. He looked over at Eloise, at her terrified face, and a decision settled in his soul. He might die here, but she wouldn't. He took a step back, positioning himself right in front of the loose stone. "All right, Malachi, you win. He jammed his knife into the mortar in pride. The stone groaned, then scraped loose. He reached into the dark cavity behind it, and his fingers brushed against a cold, oilskin-wrapped package. He pulled it out. The ledger. It was heavier than he expected, dense with secrets and sins. He held it up. "This is what you want?" Malachi's eyes gleamed with a covetous light. "Toss it here, slowly." It was then that Malachi made his mistake. He took a step forward, his attention completely fixed on the book in Jedediah's hand. In that instant, he revealed the final crushing truth. He turned his cold gaze on Eloise. "You know, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "you're protecting the memory of a fool. Liam wasn't trying to expose us. He wasn't a hero. He was trying to sell this book back to me for a fortune. He was going to take the money and leave you with nothing. He died because he got greedy, not because he was brave." The words hit Eloise like a physical blow. Her face crumpled, the last vestiges of her hope turning to ash. The man she had mourned, the man whose honor she thought she was protecting, had been just another liar. Jedediah saw the change in her, the grief, the shock, and then something else, something hard and cold. The illusion was shattered, and in its place, a terrible, liberating rage began to burn. In that same moment, Jedediah knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to toss the book. He was going to use it. With a primal roar, he threw the ledger not at Malachi, but straight into the air, end over end. For a split second, every eye, including Malachi's, followed its arc. And in that split second, Jedediah lunged. Not at Malachi. He lunged sideways, grabbing the loose stone he had just removed from the chimney. It was heavy, jagged, a weapon made of history and desperation. At the same instant, Eloise, freed from the ghost of her husband, let out a piercing scream and charged, not away, but directly at the man nearest to her, clawing at his face like a cornered wildcat. The clearing erupted into chaos. The battle for the ledger, for their lives, had begun. The fight was a blur of savage, desperate motion. The brethren, caught off guard by the sudden, suicidal charge, were momentarily thrown into confusion. Jedediah used that confusion. He brought the heavy stone down on the head of the outlaw closest to him, who dropped without a sound. He didn't stop. He vaulted over the fallen man, grabbing his pistol from its holster, and fired twice. Two more of Malachi's men crumbled into the snow. The pristine white clearing was suddenly stained with crimson. Eloise fought with a ferocity that stunned the man she'd attacked. He raised his rifle to club her, but she was too close, a whirlwind of fists and nails. She drove her knee into his groin, and as he doubled over, she snatched a knife from his belt and scrambled away, back towards the cover of the chimney. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, forged in the fires of betrayal. The ledger landed in a deep snowdrift with a soft thud, momentarily forgotten in the maelstrom of violence. Malachi, his face contorted in a mask of fury, drew his own revolver and fired at Jedediah. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of snow. Jedediah ducked behind the crumbling hearth, the old stones providing meager cover. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had something they didn't. He knew this terrain, this clearing, this ruin. It was his backyard. For years he'd unknowingly walked this ground, his mind subconsciously mapping every rock, every dip, every advantage. "Get the book!" Malachi screamed, his voice cracking with rage. Silas and another man broke off, scrambling toward the snowdrift where the ledger had fallen. Jedediah knew he couldn't let them get it. He fired his last shot, forcing them to dive for cover. He was out of ammunition. He tossed the empty pistol aside and drew his heavy hunting knife. He looked over at Eloise, who was huddled behind the other side of the chimney, the stolen knife clutched in her hand. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a burning resolve. They were in this together, to the end. Silas reached the snowdrift first. He plunged his good arm into the powder, a triumphant grin on his face. "I've got it!" he yelled. But as he pulled the oilskin package free, a new sound split the air. Not a gunshot. It was a low, guttural growl. Silas froze. From the dense woods behind him, a massive shape emerged. A grizzly bear, awakened from its winter slumber, angry and hungry. The firefight had drawn it here. The wilderness, the very force they had tried to use as a weapon against Eloise. had just chosen a side. The bear rose on its hind legs, letting out a deafening roar that shook the trees. The remaining brethren stared in horror. This was a force of nature they could not fight. Silas, his eyes wide with primal fear, dropped the ledger and tried to scramble away, but he was too slow. The bear swatted him aside like a rag doll, his body thrown against a tree with a sickening crunch. The last outlaw turned to run, but tripped in the deep snow. The bear was on him in an instant. It was just Malachi and Jedediah now, the preacher and the ghost, facing each other across a clearing littered with their dead. The bear, its bloodlust sated for the moment, was sniffing at the bodies, ignoring the two men left standing. Malachi raised his pistol, his hand trembling slightly. "It seems God has a strange sense of humor," he said, his voice strained. "That wasn't God," Jedediah replied, his knife held ready. "That was the mountains, and they don't forgive." He took a step forward. This was it, the final reckoning. 10 years of running, of hiding, of grief, had all led to this single moment. He wasn't fighting for a ledger anymore. He was fighting for the man he used to be, the marshal, the husband, the father. He charged, not with a roar, but in chilling silence, the ghost finally coming to claim his due. The final confrontation was not a prolonged, dramatic duel. It was brutal, clumsy, and short. Malachi, for all his charisma and cunning, was not a fighter. He was a manipulator, a snake who coiled around others to do his killing. Faced with the raw, focused fury of Jedediah Boone, he panicked. He fired his pistol wildly, the shot going high, whistling past Jedediah's ear. Before he could fire again, Jedediah was on him. He slammed into Malachi's chest, the impact driving the air from the older man's lungs. They both went down in the snow, grappling for the gun. The pistol went off one last time, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the earth. Jedediah wrenched the weapon from Malachi's grasp and threw it away. He had the man pinned, his forearm pressed against Malachi's throat. Malachi's eyes were wide with shock and fear, the mask of the calm, confident leader stripped away, revealing the pathetic coward beneath. It would be so easy to end it, to press down, to feel the life fade from him, to finally get the vengeance he had dreamed of for a decade. His hand tightened. "Jedediah, don't." The voice was Eloise's. It cut through the red haze of his anger. He looked over. She was standing a few feet away, the ledger clutched to her chest. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were clear. "Don't become him," she said softly. He looked down at the sputtering, gasping man beneath him. She was right. Killing him now would be an execution, not justice. It would make him no better than the monsters he hunted. He let out a long, shuddering breath and eased the pressure. He didn't kill Malachi. He rolled off him, grabbed a length of rope from one of the dead men's saddles, and tied Malachi's hands behind his back, pulling the knots brutally tight. "You're going to stand trial," Jedediah said, the words tasting strange and familiar on his tongue. "You and every name in this book. You're going to face the law." Malachi just glared at him, his face a mask of impotent hatred. The great man was reduced to a common prisoner. The bear, having finished its grisly work, lumbered back into the forest, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a profound, ringing silence. Jedediah walked over to Eloise. He gently took the ledger from her hands. It felt like the heaviest thing in the world. They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the snow around them stained with the price of their freedom. They didn't hide. They didn't run west into the unknown territories. They gathered the brethren's horses, tied the seething Malachi to a saddle, and they rode east, back towards the world they had both fled, back towards civilization. They were no longer running from their past. They were riding to confront them, armed with the one weapon that could destroy the shadows for good, the truth. Days later, they rode into the bustling town of Redemption, a place whose name felt like a promise. They were a strange sight, a grizzled mountain man, a woman with old ghosts in her eyes, and a notorious outlaw leader tied to a horse. They ignored the stares, the whispers. Jedediah walked straight into the U.S. Marshal's office, Eloise at his side. He slapped the oilskin-wrapped ledger down on the desk in front of a young, astonished-looking deputy. "My name is Jedediah Boone," he said, his voice clear and strong. and I'd like to make a full report. As they stepped back out into the bright sunshine, leaving the chaos and the future of the brethren in the hands of the law, Eloise reached over and took his hand. Her touch was warm, certain. They didn't know what the future held. They were two broken souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm. But for the first time in a very long time, they were not looking back at the shadows. They were looking forward at the long, open road ahead, a road they would walk together. So, if you ever find yourself thinking that the wilderness only holds darkness, or that a person's past is a chain that can never be broken, remember the story of the ghost and the woman he found in the snow. Remember that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that teach you how to fight, and the quietest people are the ones with the strength to change the world. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that like button and maybe even subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Thanks for stopping by the fire.